Welcome, everyone, to the book reading of the Toronto Food Film Festival. Welcome. We'd like to start with the land acknowledgement for Toronto. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Hi, my name's John Oda, and I'm the moderator for today's reading. I'd please like to welcome Lenore Newman, who is the author of Lost Feast, Culinary Extinction and the Future of Food. So this is the cover. I have the digital version, so this is the cover. And Lenore, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It is great to be here. And I'm coming from you today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam people out here on the sunny West Coast, and very happy to be joining all of you in your living rooms and kitchen tables and such. And today I'm going to be giving a couple of readings with some questions intermingled. And I wanted to start today with a first reading that's sort of adapted from the book, which I have my beat up reading copy here, which I'll be opening later. And it's just great to be speaking today, even if from afar. And special thanks to everyone for making this happen, and also a special acknowledgement to my partner, Catherine, who the book is dedicated to for good reason, because it dominated our lives for several years. And I want to start today with a bird in these strange times. I want to begin with Martha. Martha was the last passenger pigeon, and this is, of course, a passenger pigeon on the front of the book. Martha lived 4 lonely years in the Cincinnati Zoo as the last of her kind. And we actually have a word for that. It's called an endling, the last individual of a species. Very terrible word. And when she died in the afternoon of September 1st, 1914, surrounded by her keepers, who were very fond of her, a horrible milestone was reached for the human species. It was the first time in human history we watched a species die. And something about that milestone got under my skin. It rattled around in the back of my mind like a little feathered ghost. And by the end of the passenger pigeon, though, it really isn't about Martha, even though she's very easy to visualize. It was about technology and about humanity's reach exceeding our grasp. And I want you to consider the passenger pigeon for a minute. They weighed about a pound. They were 15 to 18 inches in length. The males were very striking. They were covered in patches of copper, blue, gray, purple. The females were a little more subdued, but they had a gentle little calling pattern that would haunt the forests of eastern North America, and a call that no living person has now heard. But their individual attributes are what made them special. As a whole, they were the most plentiful bird species to ever live. There were over 5 billion passenger pigeons, forming huge flocks of millions of birds, including, for those of you in Toronto, those who passed over early Toronto's skies. Passenger pigeons are thought to have made up 40% of North America's bird life. They roosted to bear young, covering hundreds of acres in nests. However, they couldn't stay in one place more than a season. They created incredible destruction wherever they landed because there were so many of them. And so they would circle in a great migration, flying in arcs from the shores of Hudson's Bay to the American South, traveling at speeds of up to 80 kilometers an hour. They were fast. And their Latin name actually refers to traveling. They're traveler birds. Through numbers and speeds, they really did dominate the skies. And the question that should be in your mind already is, how on earth did we kill them all? There were more of them than any other bird. How come I go outside and run into seagulls and crows, but no passenger pigeons? And it really is an interesting story that touches on all aspects of our food system. They dominated the skies. Descriptions boggle the mind. Alexander Wilson, the father of American ornithology, studied the birds in Kentucky in 1810 and described them as a living darkness, a loud rushing wind similar to a tornado. His competitor, John Audubon, who many of you might know the name, described a 3-day dusk as the birds passed along the Ohio River in 1813, blocking the sky. He said the air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as if by an eclipse. Beyond this grandeur, this living wind of birds, we can say something else about the passenger pigeon. They were probably pretty tasty. The indigenous people of North America, of course, ate passenger pigeons. From histories of the Iroquois Confederacy, we know that in pigeon years, when the great flocks arrived, groups of people came together to hunt, process the food, and set treaties and marriages. They dried pigeons. They smoked pigeon, fermented pigeon in pits to make grease. But indigenous groups didn't even dent the pigeon population for two critical reasons. They didn't kill young birds, and they didn't chase the birds when they left. And then settlers from Europe arrived. Passenger pigeon became a ubiquitous dish and actually saved several settlements from starvation. The pigeons would arrive, and they were basically free food. And at first, we didn't really dent the population either, those settlements. Alexander Wilson noted that it was so common to have passenger pigeon in the 1800s that it was the order of the day at every roadside tavern. It was on offer at dinner, breakfast, and supper, and actually became a little sickening after a while because it was literally sometimes all there was to eat. So what happened? Well, 3 technologies doomed the pigeon: the public market, the railway, and the telegraph. When a roost was sighted, the telegraph operators broadcast the location to pigeon hunters, who were a little like cowboys with birds, and they would quickly arrive by railway and dispatch their hauls back to the great markets of the East. This was less hunting and more mining the sky, really. Pigeon hunters made a living out of chasing the pigeon across North America, and they often traveled with their own tame passenger pigeons, and they would sit them out on a stool tied to the stool as kind of decoys. And the other passenger pigeons say, hey, there's a pigeon down there surrounded by corn. That's got to be safe. Let's go there. The passenger pigeons clearly underestimated us. And from that, we get a term that's still used today, which is stool pigeon. Never trust a stool pigeon, people. They're out to get you. Birds poured into the great markets of the East, and our knowledge of the golden age of markets, we have writing from people like Thomas DeVoe, who ran the markets in Washington, D.C. and New York. And he just sort of described this zoo of wildfowl and birds pouring into the market to feed the great cities. And one of his favorite birds there was the passenger pigeon. And he's one of the few people to describe how it tasted in detail. He says that the wild squabs, the small birds, were fat and fresh and delicate, and that cooped birds that had been stored in fed corn were also quite good, but the wild bird was dry. And it might explain why passenger pigeon recipes almost inevitably involve trying to make it moist. So think about turkey and the lengths we go to try and make a turkey good. And in my family, there's argument: turkey upside down, turkey top side up, turkey wrapped in bacon, deep fried turkey, which inevitably burns your house down. You get the same thing with passenger pigeons. And to understand that, we have wonderful, wonderful data from Lorenzo Delmonico, who was one of the greatest restaurateurs of all time. He ran Delmonico's in New York. And he had a very famous chef called Charles Ranhofer. And Ranhofer describes the wonderful Gilded Age of pigeon eating. And he wrote a 1,000-page book on how to run a restaurant in the late 1800s. And he prepared passenger pigeon in many interesting ways, with sweetbreads, ham, mushrooms, on artichoke bottoms, or just fried wrapped in bacon and served over rice. Or if there was an elaborate meal, he would stage them with ham and truffles, or he would cook them with mirepoix and coxcomb and surround them with crawfish and foie gras to make a Southern-style dish. He also made pies, which was traditional, and the word tourtière actually comes from the French word from passenger pigeon. So the original tourtière would have been made by these pigeons that were so plentiful. And in Ranhofer's case, he would fill a pie dish with bacon and onion and pigeons. And he would, because he ran a classy restaurant, not leave the feet sticking up to indicate what kind of pie it was, which was the style at the time. So the pigeons fed the elite of the Gilded Age, but over the years they dwindled. They became rare. In 1893, the last bird was sold at Fulton Market at a premium. They vanished from the elegant plates of Manhattan, who moved on to other species. The last known wild bird, which was nicknamed Buttons, was killed in 1900, leaving 3 small captive flocks. That dwindled to 2, and then to 1 at the Cincinnati Zoo, and then to 2 birds, George and Martha. They're American, you see what they did there. And then Martha, alone, waiting for the end of her species. So what can we learn from the ghost of a bird? Surely today we have better tools. Surely we're better informed. And the death of Martha spiked an incredible interest in species preservation. A lot of American species preservation laws came out of the death of the passenger pigeon. But maybe we're better. But in the book, one of the things I then go on to is to talk about how the extinctions today that resemble the passenger pigeon are not happening in the sky, they're happening in the sea. And I think I'm going to leave it there for the first reading because it's a good point to end. And I think I'm going to open it up to questions now for John to send onward to us, just because I think it's nice to have a bit of a dialogue rather than just me being a talking head. So John, I turn it over to you for the first question session.
Thank you, Lenore. That was outstanding. Thank you. To our wonderful audience, please send in your questions through the chat box on your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. And Lenore, I love the book. Really, thank you so much. I'm really excited to meet you and to talk to you about this book. It's beautifully written, impeccably researched, and there are lots of tidbits about history and anthropology. I just love picking it up. I read it twice in one week. So let me just start this off, please. Well, actually, I'm just going to go to the audience first. I have my own questions, but somebody has written in, which modern species are most at risk?
It's a tough question. If we stick with food species, I'm very worried about bluefin. Bluefin is probably the thing we eat still that is most at risk. Bluefin populations are down 80 to 90% across most of the Atlantic, and also dropping in the Pacific. The problem is they're very slow breeding. You can't breed them in captivity. They're extremely valuable, as most people know, for sushi. And they're very large. They're very few in number. Definitely very endangered. So I think that would be that's the one I worry about the most. And that actually goes most fish species I worry about. They're a little easier to kill. We've actually to date not had as many oceanic extinctions just because we haven't had as long to do it. But they're hard to keep track of. They move around. They're in international waters, so protection has to be international. yeah, bluefin, probably number one, but there's a lot of other fish that are on that list.
So that moves, thank you for that. That's great. Very enlightening. That moves right into the next question, which is what specific lifestyle changes have you adopted after researching and writing this book?
That is a great question. And I'm a fisherman's daughter. I literally grew up in a food business. And for me, that was, I definitely grew up eating wild food. I went vegetarian because of this research. It is the biggest change you can do to protect species. And if, now I would say one of the reasons I like it so much, it is also incremental. I mean, it's not like buying a Tesla where you buy the Tesla, then boy, you are committed. You just spent all your money on a Tesla. Whereas you can decide I'm going to eat vegetarian 2 meals a day or 4 days a week. And if you're like, oops, I had a total like turkey binge because it was Thanksgiving, that doesn't matter. You can pick it up again. Going straight up vegan is probably the single best thing you can do for the environment, bar none. Part of that is because cows are so environmentally intensive, and I talk a lot about that in the book. I get a lot of flack for that, but I mean, numbers are numbers. And if we look at probably the worst environmental disaster unfolding on Earth right now is the destruction of the Amazon, the wholesale destruction of one of the greatest sources of biological diversity on Earth. And that is happening to provide beef and dairy to North Americans. And let's not for a minute think that's not what's driving it. So it's probably the only way we can save the Amazon. We have to move away from those products somewhat. And like I said, it can be incremental, it can be total. Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah. The next question is, can you tell us more about deep frying a turkey?
Oh, yeah. It's one of my, don't do it, number one. So in the southern US, and I've spent quite a bit of time in America and also touring around, in the southern US, there is a technique for cooking a turkey, which is deep frying it in a drum. And it actually is, bar none, the best way to cook a turkey because it's done in 15 minutes and it's really moist, but it is incredibly dangerous, like bizarrely dangerous. And one of my favorite stories of that is outside of, in southern Louisiana, outside of New Orleans, a fire department decided we can't handle this. And for a Thanksgiving, they offered to deep fry everyone's turkey safely. They burnt the fire station down. So don't deep fry a turkey, but really horrible injuries and fires come out of that, but boy, it's fast and it actually keeps it moist. So there you have it.
Good, I'm glad. Thanks for that. The next question is, when the pigeon was starting to decline, did your research show any conservation efforts happen at that time?
Yes, massive efforts. It's one of the first species they really tried to save. They probably would have been successful if passenger pigeons bred in captivity. Why they were so vulnerable is they really did need millions of pigeons because they were such a flocking bird. Like their whole adaptation, their Darwinian adaptation to predation was to have lots of pigeons in one spot. And so people noticed, but it was already too late. In the kind of period where you could have done something, what was happening was the flocks were being dispersed before they could breed, and also single birds were being killed, but because they mated for life, they wouldn't rebond. And so it looked like you had a lot of pigeons, but what you really had was a lot of old single pigeons. And the old single pigeons weren't going to get back in the pigeon game. And so by the time they realized what was happening and tried desperately to protect the species, it was too late. It caused a shift in thinking. No one believed they were extinct. For a long time, there were rewards to find a passenger pigeon. People thought People thought they were in South America. People thought they were in Europe. People thought they were in space rather than face the truth that we ate them all.
I love the piece in your book where you talk about Thomas Jefferson and how people did not believe there could be such a thing as extinction.
Yes.
And it's amazing. Yes.
Well, it is a rather horrible idea if, from a Western concept, you're coming from a land where everything has been created by God. The idea you could kill it is really awful. And it took them a long time to accept it. And, for a long time, there were people who just flat out believed that if you killed a species, it would boink back up somehow.
So I have a question for you, please. Where did this begin? What's the seed of this idea of a book on extinction and foods of the past that we loved and that are gone now? Where did this come from?
Well, it was kind of a slow burn. It actually began, I was in Cleveland, which, to be honest, is a good place to ponder the ending of things, because Cleveland lost about 70% of its population. So a lot of the city is in ruins, but it's also got some really vibrant food scene. And I was down there doing research, and I was actually at the West Side Market, which was a site where pigeons were sold. And it happened to be at the same time as the centenary of the death of the passenger pigeon. And because I was in Ohio, there was a big to-do about it, because Martha died in Ohio, in Cincinnati, and I was fairly close. And so I read about it, it just stuck in my head. And I started to ask myself the question, and I think I talk a bit about this in the book: how many food species have we pushed to extinction? Because I did have a friend who really believed that shouldn't happen, that those species should be safe. And it turned out there were a lot more than I thought. And it got me thinking, and I started keeping notes, and next thing you know, it was a book. It was a really hard book to write. There were several times where I was like, oh, what the heck have I gotten myself into? And some of the parts were a little depressing. So yeah, it was... there was a labor of love, for sure.
Yeah, good for you. Drove it through. That's great. There's a question here. What is your opinion on genetically manipulating breeds for consumption to save a wild species?
I am a fan of GMOs now. Definitely genetic modification can do things for us to help solve these problems if applied carefully. And I think, in a way, the first wave of genetic modification in food crops didn't do us any favors, because there were some public failures that caused a lot of fear, quite rightly so. And so, to me, we need those technologies, especially some of the ones to help strengthen, to increase output of plant species, etc. So I'm a big fan. I'm even a fan of some of the attempts to bring back extinct species through CRISPR genetics, although it's really hard to say if any of those will ever work. It's way easier to not kill the thing than try and bring the thing back. I think there's probably a lot of mythology and even children's stories about, try not to kill the thing, don't bring it back.
Yeah, so that moves right into this question, and you've answered it a bit already. Outside of hunting and fishing regulations, tracking and reducing our consumption, what else can we do to help?
Well, as I've said, go veg is number one. Number two is do support biodiversity in the food system. So if you have local farmers who are growing heirloom varieties, etc., make sure you buy from them. Even if it's a bit more expensive, make sure they are supported in what they're doing. Also, one of the things I do stress in the book, if you have any kind of land whatsoever, which a lot of us don't in the cities, but even if you do, plant species that wild things like. For God's sakes, if you got a lawn, get rid of that lawn. It could be almost anything. It could be a little tiny patch of forest. It could be a bee garden, and bees need our help. And that's one of the things I stress is everyone needs to go plant things that bees like. Don't put chemicals on them. And rewilding is going to be a word you're going to hear a lot more of, Right now, about 40% of the Earth's surface is used for crops and for grazing and fodder. We need to get that number down. We're going to be trying to restore ecosystems all over the world. So to be honest, so we don't die. Also, and kind of pertinently, and it happened after the book, of course, the more wild land we destroy, the more likely we're going to have what are called zootropic viruses enter our system. And we're dealing with one right now. COVID happened in part, and I mean, there's no smoking gun, but viruses like COVID come from wild populations that are being pushed by us. So as we clear the Amazon to grow cows, we're probably going to disrupt some viruses that are not going to be too nice to us. And we've kind of seen what one can do now. And it scares me. I don't want more of them.
Yes. There's one more question here. And I know that it's 2:56. We're going to go to 3:10. Did you want to do, I can ask this question and then maybe we can go to your.
Go back for a short reading. I have a little snippet I like to read. So yeah, one more question.
One more question. Let's do one more. Could Lenore talk more about cellular agriculture and how this may help extinction of certain species?
Yes, cellular ag is emerging rapidly, and it is discussed in the book at length. So in cellular agriculture, you create animal products without animals, in short. And a large discussion of it would take up too much time. But in the term, there are basically two things you can do. You can grow a burger in a vat using cell culture. That's really hard. It's going to take a while. Lots of people are working on it. Call it 5 to 10 years at the earliest. The other thing you can do, though, is you can take yeast and bacteria and genetically alter them to produce things other than alcohol, which they do naturally. I mean, that's how brewing works. And some of the products we get out of that are things like insulin is made in that way, and also vegetable rennet for cheese. And there's a number of companies that are pushing forward to make dairy proteins that way. And basically, a company that used yeast-derived technology to create dairy could create milk that acted exactly like milk from a cow, with about 5% of the land resource, water resource, and environmental resource. It's one of the biggest potential wins for the environment out there. It's moving forward. And if we were in California, which we can't be, we actually could buy ice cream in San Francisco now on the street and sit there and eat it. And it would be dairy ice cream that didn't come from a cow. So keep your eye out for that one. That one is going to be really interesting.
Good. Thank you. All right. Why don't we go ahead with the reading then?
All right. I have a little reading that this is my favorite part of the book. And it also is my favorite because I am trapped in British Columbia right now, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but I travel for a living. And so this is the longest I've been in one place in a very long time. And this was my favorite little bit of research. And it happened at a really odd time of my life. And it was very, very nice. So this is from Across the Seas of Grass, and it's about bison.
Yeah.
You think we need another can of gas? My friend Shannon was expertly arranging and rearranging tubs full of supplies. Water, first aid kit, survival kit, tent and gear, spare car parts, bug spray, more bug spray. The woman had traveled with me before. The living room looked as if we were mounting a major expedition. And in a way we were. 3,000 kilometers north on a research trip to some of Canada's most remote and beautiful landscapes. We would also be traveling back in time to a world before farming, to the world of grasslands, tundra, and most importantly, megafauna. If I wanted to understand the mammoth and the culinary extinctions that allow the existence of the modern cow, I needed a landscape grand enough to put the cow into perspective. I also had a few standing invitations in the Yukon to sample northern cuisine. Canada's north isn't forgiving, and this was the sort of trip I didn't want to do alone. Fortunately, I had a friend insane enough to drive north with me, a friend who was comfortable in the wilderness and would ensure I didn't end up as a pile of bleached bones on the tundra because I forgot the insect repellent. Lawyer by day, Shannon was a serious wilderness buff. We had 2 spare tires, road flares, fire starters, emergency blankets, axes, knives, folding shovels. Jude, Shannon's active little black cat, hopped from container to container looking concerned. Another can of gas, Shannon remarked. You just never know. And maybe an extra axe. And more snacks. Yes, more snacks, I said. I approve of snacks. I fished Jude out of the supply tub and turned my thoughts to the north. I wanted to see the world before farming. I wanted to lose myself between the sky and the waving seas of grass. The north is the living shadow of the Paleocene, a world without farms or fences. Driving north took several days of winding highways and sprawling forests. By the time we reached Dawson City, the sun barely bothered to dip below the horizon. It was July, and midnight was as bright as a lazy summer evening back home. We feasted on sourdough bread spread thick with fireweed jelly, sampled spruce tips, and sipped Labrador tea. One morning, a lovely chef served me a stack of sourdough pancakes studded with wild blueberries. I slept long, ate well, and breathed crystal air. Most days, the horizons were free of human presence and the world boiled with wildlife. Ravens squawked and chortled at us, and black bears gave our car menacing glances. And one evening, all the hair rose on the back of my neck as a grizzly did exactly what it pleased as it passed through our camp. The sky was the deepest of blues, the air smelled of herbs and sunlight and ice. I found a really friendly pizza joint in Mayo, Yukon, and it had a sign on the wall listing the coldest recorded temperature at that spot at minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the endless summer shimmered on the river, a tease. There were, shall we say, a few insects. Even with the repellent, mosquitoes would settle on me like a blood-sucking blanket. They hung over the landscape like smoke. Shannon, who is quirkily immune to all insect life, would watch in interested horror as my neck swelled. I tried to be brave. Did you know there is a type of mosquito that feeds on tea? Shannon, serene in the knowledge that every insect in the north was feeding on me, was sitting with her arms bare to the sun. Let me guess, the tea from those plants is more expensive. Yes, it tastes different because the plant has an immune response to the bites. The leaves develop an enzyme. A few days later, after marveling at shimmering green lakes and wind-ruffled hillsides, I found what I was looking for. We rounded a corner as we dropped back into the province of British Columbia, and we were surrounded by wood bison. They meandered along the road, blocking our path. Shannon and I stared as the massive creatures, as they walked in front of the car. There were dozens of them. They were beautiful and wild, and their great coats were full and shining. The males watched us warily, and the females nudged along the calves, who were a much lighter shade of brown. They were surrounded by thick clouds of flies that didn't seem to bother them particularly, though a 1.5-inch long bulldog horsefly found my arm and carried off a small chunk of flesh. The grand animals shuffled past us, munching on the grass. They probably were no heavier than dairy cows, but they felt bigger. Maybe it was the landscape. Maybe I just felt smaller. A soft brown stream of plush muscle. They stopped us in our tracks. And I had the overwhelming urge to get out of the car and sink my fingers into the thick shoulder fur. They looked like they were wearing the world's most luxurious shawl. I felt for a moment what it was like to stare into the Pleistocene, that golden age where we find the beginning of anthropological culinary extinction. All right, that is my encounter with the bison.
Oh, it was so nice to hear you read that. I really enjoyed reading it in the book, but I really enjoyed hearing from you on that.
Well, and the funny thing that's not in the book, but and I am what's known as a pretty tough chick. Grew up on a fish boat. I actually started to cry when we were surrounded by bison. I don't know why. I just did. It was just, they're unfenced. They're one of the last wild herds on Earth, and there they were, just hanging out. And there was this moment where I'm just like, this is incredible.
Isn't that nice? That's great. I loved that chapter. There are a number of chapters that I loved. I loved your bee chapter. But building on what you were just talking about, the one that I was, I don't know if you can see this, it's the woolly mammoth.
Yes.
The woolly mammoth chapter. I was completely astonished. How did you research that? I'm like, and I can't believe that people ate them.
Oh, people ate a lot of them. I mean, they were a big part of our development as a species. And yeah, the mammoth chapter took a lot of digging, a lot of library. That one was actually largely written while I was living in New York with my partner. And a lot of that was written in the Rose Room in the New York Public Library. And drawing a lot on these primary sources about mammoths and about how they were discovered, how they entered the world as a species that actually existed. And yeah, they're quite an amazing species. And also all around this mythology that people had eaten mammoth meat, which turned out probably not be true. Yeah, really quite an amazing beast. But it's easy to see why we killed them all, is because yeah, they're big, they're slow, they breed very slowly. And yeah, they're this giant storehouse of meat if you can manage to kill one.
Oh, I was so upset when I heard that. Oh, God. And then
don't worry about that.
Another chapter was the sea cow.
Yes, they didn't last long. They tasted amazing, apparently.
Somebody said it tasted like corned beef.
Yes, but also we have to remember those people were very hungry, and yeah, they didn't last long at all. Once again, very slow breeding. One of the few oceanic extinctions for culinary reasons. Yeah, and they were Stellar sea cow was hunted to extinction very quickly. One of the more interesting notes is people actually killed them for their milk because it was so good, and so you got to wonder what that was like.
Oh my goodness. Well, the bluefin tuna, your concern with that is it really affects me because first of all, I think they're beautiful when as animals, but yeah, they just don't seem to stand a chance right now.
Well, no, and they're so valuable and they are so delicious, which is the problem. I mean, bluefin tuna, proper bluefin tuna is transcendent. I mean, I don't know why anyone cooks it. I mean, it's a crime. It's so good raw. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's pretty hard not to take that last bite. So I really hope there are a number of companies trying to create bluefin tuna meat from cellular agriculture, and they would actually probably print it on 3D printers into little cubes. I'm really hoping they're successful because once we have good substitutes, we don't need to kill the wild ones, and hopefully they can repopulate and survive. But yeah, they are very prized and they're very valuable. So it does make it a tough sell. And attempts at farming them have been mixed at best.
Right, right. And how about the salmon in British Columbia? You know, I saw in the newspaper that the one of the parties was going to say that they were going to increase stocks somehow, and there was no detail on that. I don't know how somebody can say something like that. What would you say to something like that?
Well, it's heartbreaking. The salmon is the keystone species out here for Indigenous people and settler culture. My own family has a deep history with salmon fishing. My dad was a halibut fisherman, but his brothers and father were all salmon fishermen. If we cannot reverse climate change, we will lose the salmon on the Pacific coast. It's math. They need a certain water temperature, they won't have it. They need a certain water temperature in the ocean, they need a certain water temperature in the rivers, they will not have it, they will disappear. And a giant piece of our culture will go with them. So anything we can do we have to do. Now, I do tell people if you want to eat seafood, which I've also been abstaining from, but it's harder for me because I grew up immersed in seafood, but do pick ocean wise. Do eat lower on the food chain because it matters. And, if you do happen to live in a salmon region, help with restoration, with shading streams, with fighting to make sure water levels in rivers are high enough. And we have to fight climate change. And in terms of big impacts, I always tell people, well, if you can ditch your car, do it. I can't because of my job, but I try to do what I can on that front. Try go veg, watch how much electricity you're using. People get really obsessed about flying. It's actually not that big a deal. So if you want to take that trip after COVID, take it. There's other places you can cut your impact way more. And travel, I think, is very valuable for all of us. Maybe not quite as much travel as, say, I do, but, it's not the big one. The big ones are in food. And the reason food is such a critical one is you can actually tip it the other way. If we shift the way that we create food, we can actually store carbon in the food system. We can make it carbon positive. And that's one of the only things we can do that for. When you buy that Tesla, it's still creating a carbon footprint, it's just smaller. Mm-hmm. If you help create a world where we can rewild like 20% of the globe's land, you've solved climate change. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm. Great. Unfortunately, we have to wind up soon. I just want to ask you, do you have any final thoughts? Do you have any final thoughts for people?
Keep an eye out. I do have a project with another author out in Ontario. We're working on a project that hopefully will really blow people's mind about food. I can't talk about it too much yet, but it's coming along. It's my pandemic book project. But other than that, I hope everyone is staying safe and try and eat a lot of plants because it's good for the world. It's good for you. And thanks for taking time to come and join us because this was a lot of fun. It flew by. I mean, the time just disappeared.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I mean, that was a great talk, lots of great ideas. And I want to go out and do some river restoration right now and make some shade for those salmon.
Well, you go for it, but just socially distanced river restoration.
Right, that's right. So thanks. So let's see here. So this has been the Toronto Food Film Festival book reading with Lenore Newman and her book, Lost Feast. Here's the cover. It's a great book. My name's John Oda. I highly recommend this book. That's right. And thank you for talking with us today, Lenore. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. I do highly recommend this book. There. I forgot to plug the book anywhere in there. Buy my book. No, I hope you've enjoyed. And I hope everyone had a bit of fun. And I hope things are going well where you are.
Thank you. And thank you to the Toronto Food Film Festival for having this book reading. Great. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Thank you. We'll see you later. Thank you.
Take care.